Hello everyone! Tonight we begin with a story about how people once endured and treated toothaches before the age of modern dentistry, a tale of pain, resilience, and the strange remedies of the past. If you enjoy these kinds of stories, please support the channel with a like and subscription. It truly helps us grow. And write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. It's always fascinating to see who joins us from different corners of the world. Now, dim the lights, perhaps switch on a fan for that gentle background hum, and let us set off together on this night's journey. I was 31 years old when the tooth first spoke to me. That was in the spring of 1782, in the parish of St Giles in the Fields, London, where I earned my living as a journeyman bookbinder in a narrow shop that smelled perpetually of leather, glue made from boiled hooves, and the damp rot that climbed the walls each winter. The year is important. I say this because pain, like memory, requires a frame, a context in which to understand what follows. Without the year, without the place, without the precise arrangement of circumstance, my story becomes merely one of suffering, when it was in truth an education in what the body can endure and what the mind must learn to accept when modern comfort does not yet exist. The tooth was a lower molar on the left side, the second from the back. I had felt nothing amiss with it until the morning I bit into a piece of Manchett bred good white bread, not the coarse brown stuff we usually ate that my master's wife had brought from a baker near Covent Garden. The instant my teeth closed upon it, a sensation shot through my jaw that I can only describe as lightning trapped in bone. Not the dull ache one feels after sleeping poorly, nor the tenderness that sometimes followed a night of too much gin and argument. This was sharp, immediate, and it left behind an echo that pulsed in rhythm with my heartbeat. I spat the bread into my palm and ran my tongue over the tooth. The surface felt no different than it ever had, smooth enough, with the slight roughness that comes from years of chewing and grinding. No crack that I could detect, no obvious hole. Yet when I pressed my tongue against it deliberately, the pain returned, though less severe. A warning, a whisper before the shout. My master, Thomas Hickley, was a man of 40-some years who had survived the pox as a child and bore the scars of it across his cheeks and forehead like a map of some foreign pitted country. He glanced up from the volume he was stitching, a collection of sermons bound for a gentleman in Bloomsbury, and asked what ailed me. I told him it was nothing, merely bit my tongue. He grunted and returned to his work. We did not speak of small discomforts in those days. A man's body was his own concern until it prevented him from labour, and even then, complaint was considered a form of weakness. The shop where I worked stood in a court off Drury Lane, a passage so narrow that two men could not walk abreast without turning their shoulders. The building itself leaned slightly to the east, as did most of the structures in that district, all of them settling into the London clay like old men into their beds. Above us lived a family of weavers Huguenots, who had fled France before I was born, and below, in a cellar that flooded every hard rain, a woman sold second-hand clothes and occasionally received stolen goods, though we pretended not to notice. The smell of her merchandise, musty fabric, and the lingering scent of other people's sweat rose through the floorboards and mixed with our own odours. I lived in a room I shared with two other journeymen in a lodging house 3 streets away. The room was perhaps 10 feet square, with a single window that looked onto a wall. We slept on pallets filled with straw that we replaced every few months when the lice became unbearable. Each of us kept a wooden box for our possessions. Mine contained 2 shirts, a spare pair of breeches, a comb, a prayer book my mother had given me, and a clay pipe I rarely used. We paid 4p a week for this accommodation, which included the privilege of cooking our meals over the landlady's fire if we provided our own fuel. That first day, the pain in my tooth subsided by afternoon. I ate my supper, a portion of peas pottage with a bit of bacon fat stirred in chewing carefully on the right side of my mouth. The others at the table, 6 or 7 of us crowded around a board made of planks set on trestles, spoke of the usual matters: the price of bread, the new watchman on our street who was drunk more often than sober, rumours of war with the Dutch or the Spanish or whoever it was we were supposed to fear that season. I contributed little to the conversation. My attention kept returning to the tooth, probing it gently with my tongue as one might touch a wound to see if it had begun to heal. Would you ignore such a warning? Would you tell yourself, as I did, that it was merely the result of biting down wrong, that it would pass, that the body repairs itself if left alone? I think most would. We were not taught, in those days, to rush towards treatment. Treatment meant expense, meant submission to practices that often caused more harm than the original complaint. Better to wait, to hope, to trust in time and the body's own mysterious workings. For 3 days, the tooth remained quiet. I began to believe I had been fortunate, that whatever had troubled it had resolved itself. I returned to chewing on both sides of my mouth. I ate the hard cheese we bought from a cellar near St. Martin's Lane. I drank the small beer we were allotted with our midday meal. I even laughed at a jest one of the other journeymen made about our master's habit of counting the sheets of paper twice before allowing us to cut them, and in laughing I felt the tooth, felt it whole and present and seemingly content. On the 4th day, I woke to find my left cheek slightly swollen. Not dramatically so. I could still button my collar without difficulty, but enough that when I ran my fingers over my face I felt a firmness that had not been there before. The tooth itself ached in a steady, low manner, like a wound that had been pressed upon and would not forget the pressure. I rinsed my mouth with water from the jug we shared, cold water drawn from the pump at the end of the street. The coldness made the pain sharper for a moment, then seemed to dull it slightly. I went to work. What else could I do? The shop opened at 7 o'clock, and we were expected to be at our benches before the church bells finished ringing the hour. My master was a fair man in his way, but fairness did not extend to excusing labour for minor ailments. I'd seen him work through fevers, through a terrible cough that lasted weeks, through an injury to his hand that left 2 fingers permanently bent. If he could continue, we were expected to do likewise. The work of bookbinding in those days was more demanding than people now imagine. We stood for hours at wooden benches, our backs bent over the volumes we assembled. The process began with folding the large printed sheets into smaller sections called signatures, each fold precise and aligned. Then came the sewing, threading a curved bookbinder's needle made of brass, through holes punched in the folded spines, attaching each signature to cords stretched across a sewing frame. My hands were strong from this work, my fingers calloused in particular places where the needle pressed and the thread pulled. The thread itself we waxed by drawing it across a block of beeswax, which made it slide more easily through the paper, but also left a residue that darkened our fingertips. After the sewing came the gluing, the attaching of covers, the cutting of edges, the tooling of leather if the binding was to be decorative. We used knives kept sharp as razors, and more than once I had seen a journeyman lose concentration and slice deep into his own palm. The glue we made from hide and bone boiled in a pot over a small fire in the back room until it became a thick, foul-smelling substance that we applied hot with wide brushes. The smell of it stayed in our clothes, our hair, our skin. After a few years in the trade, a man could not escape it. That morning I found it difficult to concentrate. The ache in my tooth had settled into a rhythm that matched my pulse, and with each throb came a slight sensation of heat, as though something small and angry had taken up residence in my jaw. I tried to work through it, focusing on the signatures before me, a book of household accounts that needed only basic stitching, nothing elaborate. My hands performed the familiar motions while my mind circled around the question of what to do. The options available to a man of my station were limited. I could do nothing, and hope the trouble passed. I could seek out remedies sold by the women who set up stalls in the market squares, herbalists and folk healers who offered preparations for every complaint imaginable. I could consult a barber-surgeon, though that would cost more than I liked to consider, or I could pray, which cost nothing and which many believed to be the most effective treatment for any ailment, as all suffering was understood to flow from causes both physical and spiritual. At midday, we broke for our meal. I ate little, finding that chewing intensified the discomfort. One of my fellow journeymen, a man named William Frost who had been in the trade since boyhood, noticed my careful eating and asked if I was ill. I admitted to a troublesome tooth. He nodded slowly, his expression suggesting he knew what this might mean. Frost was perhaps 10 years my senior, a thin man with grey already showing in his dark hair. He had lost 3 teeth on the left side of his mouth, molars like mine, and when he spoke one could see the gaps where they had been. He told me that tooth trouble was a curse he knew well, that he had suffered through more than one episode of the kind I was experiencing. When I asked what he had done, he said he had tried everything. Poultices of ground cloves applied directly to the aching spot, rinses made from vinegar and salt, prayers to Saint Apollonia, who was the patron of those suffering from afflictions of the teeth and mouth. Some of these had provided temporary relief. None had prevented the eventual loss of the teeth. The mention of Saint Apollonia was not unusual. In that era, we still lived with one foot in the old beliefs and one in the new. The Church of England was our official faith, but the common people retained practices that reached back centuries to times when every ailment had its patron saint and every remedy combined the physical with the spiritual. Apollonia, an aged deaconess from Alexandria, had suffered the removal of all her teeth during persecution by those who opposed the Christian faith, then threw herself into flames rather than renounce her beliefs. For this, she became the saint to whom one prayed when the teeth brought suffering. Whether the prayers worked or not was a matter of faith, but when pain reaches a certain intensity, a man will grasp at whatever comfort presents itself. That evening, I stopped at an apothecary's shop on my way home. The establishment was small, its shelves lined with jars and bottles containing substances both familiar and mysterious. The apothecary himself, a stout man with spectacles that magnified his eyes to an unsettling degree, asked what I required. I explained about the tooth, the swelling, the persistent ache. He nodded and moved among his shelves with the confidence of long practice. What he gave me was a small cloth bag containing dried cloves, along with instructions to place one between my cheek and the affected tooth, letting the oil from the cloves seep into the gum. He also sold me a vial of oil of cloves, which he said I could apply with a small cloth if the pain became severe. The cost was 6pence, a not inconsiderable sum when one earned perhaps 10 shillings a week, and half of that went to lodging and food. But pain has a way of making such calculations seem less important. I returned to my lodging and tried the remedy. The clove, when placed against my gum, produced an immediate burning sensation, followed by a numbness that was almost pleasant. The oil, applied with a corner of cloth, did something similar but more intensely. For perhaps an hour I felt relief, real relief, and allowed myself to hope that this would be sufficient. I lay on my pallet and listened to the sounds of the house, footsteps above, voices through the walls, the scrabbling of rats in the spaces between floors. London was never quiet, even at night. There was always some noise, some reminder that one lived surrounded by thousands of others, all of them struggling through their own difficulties. The relief did not last. By midnight, the ache had returned, creeping back like water finding its level. I lay in the darkness and felt the pulse of it, regular and insistent. One of my roommates snored with the rhythm of a saw cutting wood. The other muttered in his sleep, fragments of conversation with invisible companions. I counted the chimes from the church clock, marking the hours until dawn. Have you known a night that would not end? A night when the body refuses comfort and the mind circles endlessly around a single point of misery. I learned that night that pain is not merely a sensation but a kind of prison, one that removes you from the ordinary world and places you in a realm where nothing exists except the source of suffering and the desperate wish for it to cease. The swelling increased over the following days. By the end of the week, my face had taken on a lopsided appearance that others noticed. Even my master, who typically paid little attention to such matters, asked if I needed to see a surgeon. I told him I was managing, though this was less than truthful. The cloves provided moments of relief, but the underlying problem was clearly worsening. I began to understand that the tooth itself was not merely aching, but changing. When I examined it with my tongue, a habit I could not break, though each exploration brought discomfort, I detected a roughness that had not been there before. A small portion of the surface seemed to have crumbled away, leaving a depression into which food particles lodged. These particles, no matter how carefully I tried to remove them by rinsing or probing with a splinter of wood, inevitably remained, and their presence seemed to feed whatever corruption had taken hold. The word corruption is deliberate. We understood in a general way that something could go wrong with a tooth, that it could decay or become diseased, but the mechanism was mysterious. Some believed it was caused by humours in the body becoming imbalanced, too much black bile or too much heat. Others thought it the result of worms that bored into the tooth from within, creatures too small to see but capable of creating holes and causing immense suffering. Still others saw it as punishment, divine correction for sins committed, or for a constitution that was inherently weak and prone to failure. I found myself examining these theories as one might examine a theological question, searching for the explanation that would make sense of what I was enduring. If it was humours, perhaps I needed to alter my diet to consume foods that would restore balance. If it was worms, perhaps there was a way to poison them without poisoning myself. If it was punishment, perhaps prayer and repentance would provide relief. The truth, which I did not yet understand, was that none of these explanations would help, because the tooth was past the point where theory mattered. It was damaged, infected, and would not heal on its own. By the second week, I could no longer chew on the left side at all. Even the gentlest pressure brought immediate, shocking pain. I ate only soft foods, porridge, bread soaked in broth, vegetables boiled until they fell apart. I lost weight, not dramatically, but noticeably. My clothes hung differently. My face took on the gaunt quality of someone recovering from illness. The worst was the nights. During the day, when I was occupied with work and surrounded by others, the pain remained at a level I could endure. But at night, lying still, with nothing to distract my attention, it became the entire world. The throbbing would intensify until I felt certain something must burst, some pressure must find release. I would rise and pace the small room, earning muttered complaints from my roommates. I would go downstairs and sit in the kitchen where the embers of the fire still gave faint warmth, holding my jaw and rocking slightly, a motion that seemed to provide fractional comfort, though I could not have said why. The landlady found me there one such night. She was a widow of perhaps 50 years, a woman who had raised 6 children and outlived most of them. She asked what troubled me, and I told her. She disappeared for a few minutes and returned with a small bottle and a clean cloth. The bottle contained gin knot, the cheap spirit we drank in public houses, but something better, clearer, without the harsh bite of badly distilled liquor. She poured a small measure onto the cloth and told me to hold it against the tooth to let the spirits soak into the gum. I did as she instructed. The gin burned terribly at first, a fire that made my eyes water, but after the burning came numbness, blessed numbness, and for the first time in days I felt the pain recede to something manageable. She let me keep the cloth and told me to use the method as needed. I asked what I owed her. She waved the question away. In that gesture I saw a kindness that moved me more than I would have expected. She had suffered clearly. She knew what it meant to endure something that would not relent. The gin became my companion through the following nights. I would moisten the cloth and press it to my jaw, feeling the initial burn transform into relief. The effect lasted perhaps half an hour before I needed to repeat the process. I rationed the liquid carefully, knowing I could not afford to replace it. Each application seemed slightly less effective than the last, as though my body was learning to resist even this small mercy. During this period, I continued to work. I had no choice. The shop did not recognize pain as sufficient reason to miss a day unless one was literally unable to stand. I would arrive each morning, take my place at the bench and attempt to focus on the work before me. My hands knew the motions well enough that I could perform them almost without thought, which was fortunate, as my thoughts were increasingly occupied by the steady pulse of discomfort that radiated from my jaw through the entire left side of my head. My master grew concerned not because he cared particularly about my suffering, but because he could see my work was slower, less precise. I had already spoiled 2 gatherings of sheets by cutting them incorrectly, and had nearly ruined a fine leather cover by applying glue too thickly. These were errors a journeyman should not make. He took me aside one afternoon and told me plainly that I needed to address whatever was wrong, that he could not afford to have materials wasted. I understood his position. He was not a wealthy man. The shop earned enough to keep him and his wife in modest comfort and to pay his journeymen their wages. But there was no excess. Every sheet of good paper, every length of leather, every pot of carefully made glue represented an expense that had to be justified by the finished work we produced. If I could not work to standard, he would need to find someone who could. That conversation forced my hand. I could not afford to lose my position. Work in London was competitive, and journeymen who gained a reputation for unreliability found themselves without employment quickly. I needed to seek treatment, regardless of cost or consequence. The question was where to go. London in 1782 offered several options for someone with tooth trouble, though none were particularly appealing. There were the barber-surgeons who practiced a profession that combined cutting hair, trimming beards, minor surgery, and the removal of teeth that had become unbearable. There were also men who specialised in teeth, who called themselves operators or dentists, though the latter term was relatively new and not yet fully established. These specialists were generally more expensive than barber-surgeons, but claimed greater skill. I made inquiries among the other journeymen and the various tradespeople I encountered in the neighbourhood. The name that came up repeatedly was that of a barber-surgeon named Thomas Rowland, who kept a shop near Seven Dials, a short walk from where I worked. He was described as competent, reasonably priced, and not overly rough. The last quality was emphasised by several people, which gave me some idea of what to expect. I went to see Rowland on a Saturday afternoon when the shop was closed, and I had some hours to myself. His establishment was on the ground floor of a building that housed several other businesses, a tailor, a seller of old books, a woman who took in washing. The shop itself was marked by the traditional pole painted in red and white spirals, a symbol everyone recognised. A bell attached to the door announced my entrance. The interior was cleaner than I had expected, though that is not saying much. The floor was swept at least, and the air smelled of the soap and bay rum that barbers used after shaving. There was a chair in the centre of the room, a substantial piece of furniture with wooden arms and a high back. Against the walls stood shelves holding razors, scissors, various tools whose purpose I could only guess at, and several glass jars containing items I tried not to examine too closely. Rowland himself was a man in his late 40s, broad-shouldered and thick-armed, with hands that looked better suited to carpentry than delicate work. He wore a leather apron over his clothes, stained with substances I chose not to identify. When he spoke, his voice was gruff but not unkind. He asked what I needed. I explained about the tooth, how long it had been troubling me, what I had tried. He nodded and gestured for me to sit in the chair. I did so, feeling the wood solid beneath me and the arms at a height that suggested they were meant to restrain as much as support. He positioned himself beside me and told me to open my mouth. The examination was brief. He peered into my mouth, prodded the swollen area with a finger, which sent a jolt of pain through me that I struggled not to show, and made a thoughtful sound. When he stepped back, his expression told me what I had already begun to suspect. The tooth could not be saved. It had broken in a way that exposed the inner portion, and that portion had become corrupted. The corruption had spread into the gum, and possibly into the bone of the jaw itself. If I did nothing, the infection would continue to worsen. It might eventually resolve itself. The tooth might fall out on its own, but the process would involve weeks or months of increasing misery, or the infection might spread in ways that were difficult to predict, moving through the jaw, causing fever and weakness, leading to a decline that no prayer could halt. The solution, Rowland said, was to remove the tooth entirely. The removal would be difficult, as the tooth was large and had roots that went deep, but he had performed this procedure many times and was confident he could accomplish it. The cost would be 2 shillings. 2 shillings. That was more than a day's wages, nearly a week's worth of the money I had after paying for lodging and food. I asked if there was any alternative. He shook his head. I asked how bad the procedure would be. He admitted it would be painful, very painful, but brief. 10 minutes at most, he said, and then it would be over. Would you do it? Would you submit yourself to a stranger's hands, to tools you had never seen used, to a process you understood would cause agony, all on the promise that afterward things would be better? I sat in that chair and understood that I had no real choice. The tooth had to come out. Every day I delayed made the situation worse. I told Rowland I would return on Monday with the money. The weekend passed slowly. I had agreed to the procedure but had not yet experienced it, and in that gap between decision and action, my imagination ran wild. I'd seen men after they had teeth removed, seen the swelling and marks that stained the cloth held to their mouths, heard stories of procedures gone wrong, of pieces of bone broken along with the tooth, of faintness and shock and recoveries that took weeks. On Sunday, I attended church, something I did irregularly under normal circumstances, but which now seemed important. The service was held in a building that had stood for centuries, its stones cold even in summer, its interior dim and smelling of must and old wood. I sat near the back and listened to the vicar speak of suffering as a test, of endurance as a virtue, of the rewards that awaited those who bore their burdens without complaint. His words seemed directed at me personally, though of course they were not. Every congregation contained people dealing with troubles, physical and otherwise. The message was universal, because pain was universal. After the service, I walked through streets that were quieter than usual, many shops being closed for the Sabbath. I found myself near Smithfield Market, where during the week livestock was sold and where public discipline was sometimes carried out. The space was empty now, except for a few people crossing through on their way to other destinations. I stood at the edge of the square and thought about pain, about how it was such a common part of existence that we built our religions and philosophies partly around the question of how to endure it. That evening, I took out the money I had saved and counted it carefully. I had enough for Roland's fee with a small amount left over. I would need to be careful in the coming weeks, would need to eat simply and avoid any unnecessary expense. But I could manage. Men with far less managed every day. My roommates noticed my preoccupation and asked what troubled me. When I explained that I was having a tooth removed, they offered advice and stories. One had undergone a similar procedure years before and said the anticipation was worse than the reality. Another had watched his brother have a tooth pulled by a travelling operator at a fair, a spectacle performed in public to attract customers. He described how the operator had made a great show of the process, had called out each step as though narrating a performance, and had produced the extracted tooth at the end like a trophy. The brother, he said, had wept throughout but survived and felt much better afterward. These stories did not comfort me. They were meant to, I suppose, but instead they emphasized what I was about to face. I thanked them and tried to sleep. The tooth throbbed steadily, a reminder that whatever I feared about the removal could not be worse than allowing the situation to continue. Monday arrived cold and grey, with a drizzle that made the streets slick and turned the usual London dirt into mud. I worked through the morning, my concentration poor, my hands performing their tasks from habit more than attention. At midday, I told my master I needed to see the barber-surgeon. He nodded and said to return when I could, though his expression suggested he expected I might not be back that day at all. I walked to Roland's shop with the 2 shillings in my pocket and a tightness in my chest that made breathing feel like deliberate effort. The streets were busy with the usual traffic. Carts hauling goods, people on foot dodging between vehicles, sellers calling out their wares, animals being driven toward market. No one paid me any attention. No one knew what I was about to endure. In a city the size of London, every kind of human experience was happening constantly. Births and endings, joys and suffering, all of it unfolding simultaneously in a vast, indifferent weave. Roland's shop was just as I remembered. The bell announced me. The barber-surgeon emerged from a back room and acknowledged my arrival with a nod. I handed him the money, which he counted and placed in a box on a shelf. Then he gestured toward the chair. I sat. The wood was hard and unyielding. Roland busied himself with preparations, gathering instruments from the shelves and arranging them on a small table within easy reach. I tried not to look too closely at what he was collecting, but I caught glimpses, pliers like tools of various sizes, something that resembled a lever, cloths that had been folded neatly. He lit a lamp even though it was daytime, wanting good light for what he was about to do. When everything was ready, he positioned himself in front of me and explained the process. He would use a tool called a dental key, a device designed to grip the tooth and provide leverage for its removal. He would insert the key carefully, work it into position, and then turn and pull. The tooth should come free in one piece if all went well. If it broke, he would need to remove the fragments individually, which would take longer but still accomplish the goal. He did not offer me anything for the pain. No draught to dull consciousness, no substance to reduce sensation. Such things existed in theory: opium, alcohol in sufficient quantity, but they were not commonly used for procedures of this kind. Pain was expected. One simply had to bear it. Roland asked if I was ready. I said I was, though this was not really a question that admitted honest answer. One is never ready for deliberate agony. One simply decides the alternative is worse and proceeds. He told me to open my mouth wide and keep it open no matter what I felt. He needed access, needed to be able to see and work without restriction. If I moved or closed my jaw, I might cause the tool to slip, might turn a difficult procedure into a dangerous one. I understood. I gripped the arms of the chair and opened my mouth. The first touch of metal against my tooth sent a shock through me. Roland worked carefully, positioning the dental key against the corrupted molar, adjusting it until he was satisfied with its placement. The device was cold, hard, and its presence in my mouth felt entirely wrong, an intrusion that every instinct screamed to resist. I forced myself to remain still. Then he turned the key. The pain was immediate and complete. It was not like the ache I'd been living with, which was sharp but localized. This was a vast, overwhelming sensation that filled my entire head, that seemed to radiate from my jaw through my skull and down my spine. I heard a sound, a grinding, tearing sound, and understood dimly that it came from inside my own body, from tooth and bone being forced to separate. Roland pulled. The pressure was immense. I felt as though my entire jaw was being torn away. My hands gripped the chair arms so tightly that later I would find my palms marked with impressions from the wood. I tried not to move, tried to keep my mouth open as instructed, but the body has its own responses to such extremity. I felt my head pull back involuntarily. Roland placed his free hand on my forehead and pushed me firmly against the chair back, holding me in position. He adjusted his grip, turned the key again. Another wave of agony. Something gave way with a sensation I can only describe as tearing, deep within the gum. I tasted something warm and metallic spreading across my tongue. What stained the cloth? What would need to be washed away afterward? My vision dimmed at the edges. A roaring sound filled my ears. Roland pulled harder. He put his weight into it, leveraging against my jaw. The tooth began to move slowly, reluctantly. Each tiny increment of motion brought fresh pain, as though 1,000 nerves were being severed one by one. I made a sound, something between a groan and a scream that I could not control. He did not pause, could not pause. Stopping now would mean starting again, would mean prolonging what was already nearly unbearable. With a final wrenching pull, the tooth came free. The relief was not immediate. The pain continued, hot and fierce, centered now in the empty space where the tooth had been. But there was a difference, a subtle shift. The thing that had been causing the original suffering, the corrupted tooth itself, was gone. What remained was the wound of its removal, and that was a different category of misery entirely. Roland held up the tooth for me to see. It was larger than I had imagined, with long roots that were stained dark. A portion of the crown was blackened, crumbled. The inner part, where it had broken, showed the corruption clearly, a discoloured, soft-looking substance that had eaten into what should have been solid. This small object, no larger than a thumbnail, had commanded my entire existence for weeks. Now it was separate from me, powerless, discarded. He dropped it into a bowl on the table and turned his attention to my mouth. He pressed clean cloths against the space where the tooth had been, applying pressure to slow the flow of what marked them. He told me to bite down gently to hold the cloth in place. I did so, tasting cotton and the sharp, unpleasant flavour of my own suffering made liquid. We waited. Roland checked the cloth periodically, replacing it when it became too saturated. Gradually the flow slowed, then stopped almost entirely. He inspected the empty socket carefully, probing it gently with a clean tool to ensure no fragments remained. I felt the probing as pressure and discomfort, but not the shocking pain of before. The worst was over. He provided me with additional cloths and instructions. Keep pressure on the wound for the next several hours. Rinse my mouth with warm water mixed with salt, which would help clean the area and promote healing. Avoid hot foods or drink for a day or two. Expect some swelling, some continued discomfort, possibly some fever. These were normal. If the wound did not begin to heal within a few days, if the swelling worsened dramatically, If I became truly feverish and weak, I should return to see him. I asked what I should do if those things happened. He was honest. There was not much to be done beyond hoping the body would fight off whatever corruption might set in. Some people healed easily from such procedures. Others did not. The outcome was partly chance, partly constitution, partly factors no one understood. I left the shop walking carefully as though sudden movement might restart the flow or reawaken the pain. The drizzle had turned to proper rain, cold drops that struck my face and ran down my neck. I pulled my coat tighter and began the walk back to my lodging. Every step required concentration. The world seemed slightly unreal, distant, as though I were watching myself from outside my own body. The immediate aftermath was in some ways worse than I had expected, and in others better. The pain in my jaw was significant but different from the steady throb of the infected tooth. This was the pain of a wound, raw and immediate, but not carrying the same sense of corruption, of something fundamentally wrong continuing to worsen. I could distinguish between pain that meant danger and pain that meant healing, and this felt more like the latter. I did not return to work that day. I went directly to my lodging, climbed the stairs to my room and lay on my pallet with a fresh cloth pressed to my jaw. My roommates were both out, which was fortunate. I did not want company. Did not want to speak or explain. I lay in the grey afternoon light that filtered through our small window and felt the pulse of my heartbeat in the wound, regular and insistent. The landlady came up after an hour or so, having heard I had returned early. She asked if the deed was done. I nodded. She brought me a cup of weak tea, cooled enough that I could sip it without pain, and told me to rest. She had seen many people through such procedures, she said. Her late husband had lost most of his teeth before he was 50, each one an ordeal similar to mine. He had survived them all, only to be taken by a fever that had nothing to do with his mouth. The body was a mysterious mechanism, she observed, prone to failure in ways that seemed almost deliberately perverse. That evening, I attempted to eat. The landlady had prepared a thin gruel, nothing that required chewing. I managed a few spoonfuls, taking them on the right side of my mouth and swallowing carefully. The act of eating, once so thoughtless and automatic, had become a deliberate process requiring attention to every movement. The night was difficult. The pain prevented any sustained sleep. I would drift into a half-conscious state, then wake suddenly when I shifted position and jarred the wound. Each time I woke, I needed several moments to remember what had happened, to understand why my jaw felt as though it had been struck with a hammer. The cloth I held against the socket became wet with what continued to seep from the wound, though less than before. I changed it twice during the night, working in darkness, my fingers finding the familiar texture of cotton and the warm slickness of injury. Morning brought some improvement. The pain had dulled slightly, settling into a steady ache rather than the sharp throbs of the previous day. The swelling had increased, however, making my face lopsided in a way that would be visible to anyone who looked at me. I examined myself in the small mirror we shared, a piece of glass so old and spotted that it showed only a dim approximation of one's features. Even in that poor reflection I could see the distortion, the left side of my jaw noticeably larger than the right. I prepared the saltwater rinse as Roland had instructed, mixing a generous pinch of salt into warm water drawn from the kettle. The first rinse was unpleasant, the salt stinging the wound, but afterward my mouth felt cleaner. I could taste less of the metallic flavour that had dominated since the extraction. I repeated the rinse several times, spitting carefully into the basin, watching the water turn pink before I emptied it out the window into the court below. My master had not expected me back so soon, but I appeared at the shop that morning regardless. I could not afford to miss more than the single afternoon. He took one look at my swollen face and suggested I might work in the back room, away from customers who might come to discuss commissions or collect finished work. I was grateful for this consideration. The back room was where we kept supplies and did the messier work of gluing and trimming. I could be useful there without needing to present myself as someone who inspired confidence. The work was harder than I had anticipated. My jaw ached constantly, and the act of concentrating on precise tasks while managing that ache required an effort that left me exhausted by midday. But I persisted. There was a satisfaction in proving to myself that I could function, that the extraction had not rendered me useless. My hands remembered their training, and I could still fold a signature cleanly, could still thread a needle and draw it through paper and cord with the proper tension. Over the following days, the wound began the slow process of healing. The swelling gradually reduced, though not uniformly. Some mornings I would wake to find it slightly worse again, as though my body could not decide whether to repair the damage or continue fighting whatever remained of the infection. I maintained the salt rinses 4 or 5 times daily and avoided any food that required significant chewing. My diet consisted largely of bread soaked in broth, boiled vegetables mashed with a fork, porridge thin enough to swallow almost without effort. The socket itself was a source of constant attention. My tongue explored it repeatedly, feeling the rough edges where the tooth had been torn away, the depression that went surprisingly deep into my jaw. The sensation was both disturbing and fascinating. I had never considered what lay beneath a tooth, had never imagined the cavity that would remain once it was gone. The space felt enormous to my tongue, though I knew it was objectively small. Food particles lodged there constantly, requiring careful rinsing to remove. Would you be able to resist exploring such a wound? Could you keep your tongue away from a space that had so recently been filled that now represented both relief and loss? I could not. The exploration became a habit, almost compulsive, as though by repeatedly checking the wound I could somehow speed its healing, or at least confirm that healing was occurring. After a week, the worst of the pain had subsided. What remained was tenderness, a sensitivity that made certain movements or pressures uncomfortable but not unbearable. The swelling had reduced to the point where it was barely noticeable, unless someone looked at me directly in good light. I began to eat more normally, though still cautiously, still avoiding the left side of my mouth. The gap where the tooth had been changed how I chewed, changed the balance and pressure of the act. I had to learn a new way of eating, compensating for an absence I would carry for the rest of my life. My master expressed satisfaction that I had recovered enough to return to full duties. The work I had spoiled before the extraction still troubled him. But he acknowledged that I was now performing to my previous standard. The incident was effectively closed, a disruption that had been managed and overcome. To him, the entire episode was simply a problem that had arisen and been solved. He did not ask about the experience itself, about what I had endured. Such questions were not part of how men of that era related to one another. You dealt with your troubles, you returned to work, and life continued. But something had changed in me. The tooth and its removal had taught me things I had not known before. I had learned what my body could endure, had learned that pain which seemed unbearable could in fact be borne if there was no alternative. I had learned that the physical self was more fragile than I had imagined, that something as small as a tooth could reduce me to misery, could dominate my existence so completely that nothing else seemed to matter. And I had learned that treatment, when treatment was available, often involved suffering almost as great as the original complaint, a cure that was itself a kind of violence. In the months that followed the extraction, I became more aware of tooth troubles in others. It was as though, having experienced the condition myself, I was now attuned to its presence in those around me. I noticed when someone chewed only on one side, when they pressed their hand to their jaw in a gesture I now recognized, when they spoke with the careful enunciation of someone managing pain. The suffering I had thought of as mine alone was in fact widespread, a common affliction that touched nearly everyone at some point in their lives. The other journeymen in the shop had stories, once I began to listen for them. William Frost, who had first advised me about cloves and St. Apollonia, had lost his 3 teeth over a period of 5 years. Each extraction had been difficult. Each had left him weakened and unable to work for days. He spoke of the fear that preceded each visit to the barber-surgeon, how he had delayed each time until the pain became absolutely intolerable. By the time he sought treatment, the infections had usually worsened to the point where the removals were more complicated than they needed to be. Another journeyman, a younger man named Peter Dutton, had lost a tooth to an operator who travelled with a fair. The operator had set up a platform in a market square and called for volunteers, promising quick and painless extractions. Dutton, desperate and unable to afford a proper barber surgeon, had submitted himself to this public spectacle. The operator had made grand gestures, had held up his tools for the crowd to see, and had pulled the tooth with a flourish while Dutton wept openly. The crowd had applauded. The operator had given Dutton a cup of gin afterward and told him he had done well. Dutton remembered the humiliation more clearly than the pain. Remembered how his suffering had been entertainment for strangers. These stories revealed a pattern. Tooth troubles were common. Treatment was often delayed until absolutely necessary. And the treatments themselves were crude and painful. There was no science to it, no systematic approach. One went to a barber-surgeon or an operator and hoped for the best. If the tooth came out cleanly and the wound healed without complication, you were fortunate. If not, you dealt with the consequences as they arose. I learned that many people simply lost their teeth over time, accepting this as inevitable. By middle age, it was common to have lost several. By old age, some had lost most or all of them. The effect on diet was significant. People without teeth could not eat meat unless it was boiled to softness, could not manage bread unless it was soaked, could not bite into an apple or tear at food the way those with full teeth could. Their diet became increasingly limited, which in turn affected their health and vitality. There were attempts to replace lost teeth, though these were crude and rarely successful. I heard of people who had purchased teeth from others' teeth extracted from corpses, usually, and had them implanted in their own jaws. The procedure involved removing a healthy tooth from a deceased person, ideally someone young who had died from causes other than disease, and securing it in the empty socket of the living person. Sometimes the body accepted this foreign tooth and it took root, becoming functional. More often, the body rejected it, and the tooth would eventually fall out, leaving the person no better off than before and sometimes worse, having introduced new infection. The trade in corpse teeth was a ghoulish business, but it existed because the need was real. People without teeth faced not just practical difficulties, but social ones. Missing teeth, especially the front ones, marked a person as poor, as someone who could not afford care or who had suffered misfortune. In a society where appearance mattered greatly for one's prospects, such visible deficiency could close doors, could limit opportunities in ways both obvious and subtle. I became aware, too, of the various remedies and preventatives that people employed, often with more hope than evidence. There were powders meant to clean the teeth, mixtures of ground chalk or charcoal that one rubbed on with a cloth or a brush made of stiff hairs. There were rinses and potions sold by herbalists, promising to strengthen the teeth and prevent corruption. Some people swore by these preparations, others saw no benefit. The truth was probably that nothing could prevent the decay of teeth once certain conditions were in place, but the act of trying provided some psychological comfort. The question of what caused tooth decay was much debated. The theory of worms boring into teeth persisted, though not everyone believed it. Some physicians taught that decay was caused by an imbalance of humours, that excess moisture or heat in the body would attack the teeth from within. Others believed it was the result of diet, that certain foods, particularly sweets, which were becoming more common as sugar became less expensive, encouraged corruption. This last theory had some truth to it, though the mechanism was not understood. We knew that people who ate more sugar seemed to have worse teeth, but we did not know why. There was also the belief that tooth troubles were hereditary, that some families were simply prone to losing teeth while others kept them well into old age. This too had an element of truth, though again the reasons were mysterious. I had known families where the father, mother and children all lost teeth young, and other families where everyone seemed to have strong, healthy teeth that lasted lifetimes. Whether this was due to some inherited quality of the body, or to shared diet and living conditions, or to some combination of factors, no one could say with certainty. Religious explanations persisted alongside these various theories. Many still saw suffering of any kind as having spiritual significance. A painful tooth might be punishment for sin, or it might be a test of faith, or it might be an opportunity to practice patience and acceptance. The prayers to Saint Apollonia were not merely superstition, but reflected a genuine belief that physical afflictions had spiritual dimensions, that addressing one's soul might have effects on one's body. I did not discount this possibility. I prayed during my own ordeal, though I could not say with confidence that the prayers had helped in any material way. But prayer provided a framework for understanding suffering, a way to feel that one was not simply a victim of random misfortune, but a participant in something larger, something with meaning even if that meaning was not immediately apparent. As I recovered fully from my own extraction and resumed normal life, I began to notice how tooth troubles shape society in ways I had not previously recognized. The barber-surgeons and tooth operators formed a distinct profession, one that existed in a curious space between respectable medicine and street performance. The barber-surgeons had guild organisation, standards of a sort, recognised places in the community. The operators were often itinerant, moving from town to town, setting up at fairs and markets, extracting teeth in public as both service and spectacle. I witnessed one such performance several months after my own extraction. I was at Bartholomew Fair, the great annual gathering held at Smithfield, a chaotic assembly of merchants, entertainers, food sellers, and people offering every service imaginable. Among them was a tooth operator, a man who called himself Dr. Pullman, though I doubt he had any legitimate claim to the title. He had erected a small platform and was calling out to the crowd, promising painless extractions, guaranteed results, teeth removed so quickly one hardly felt it. A crowd gathered, as crowds always did at the fair. The operator was a good showman. He held up his tools, polished and gleaming, and described them in dramatic terms. He displayed teeth he had extracted dozens of them, strung on wires or kept in glass jars as proof of his skill. He told elaborate stories about patients he had treated, nobles and gentlemen who had sought him out specifically, who had rewarded him generously for his services. Then he called for a volunteer. A man came forward, someone from the crowd who either genuinely needed a tooth removed or who had been planted there to serve as demonstration. The operator made a great show of examining the tooth, pronouncing it terribly diseased and in urgent need of removal. He positioned the man in a chair on the platform where everyone could see. He displayed the tool he would use, a larger, cruder version of the dental key Roland had employed on me. What followed was brutal. The operator worked quickly, forcefully, pulling the tooth with showmanship but also with genuine violence. The man in the chair thrashed and cried out. The operator held him down with help from an assistant, maintaining his running commentary throughout, assuring the crowd that this was normal, that the pain was brief, that relief would follow. When the tooth finally came free, he held it up triumphantly, and the crowd applauded. The man stumbled from the chair, holding a cloth to his mouth, his face pale. The operator pressed a coin into his hand and called for the next volunteer. I did not stay to watch more. I had seen enough to understand that what I had experienced with Roland, difficult as it was, had been relatively humane compared to what others endured. Roland had at least worked in private, had taken some care with the procedure, had provided aftercare instructions. These public operators were primarily concerned with speed and spectacle. The teeth came out, certainly, but at what cost to the patient beyond the immediate pain I could only imagine. The proliferation of operators and barber-surgeons reflected the scale of the problem. Tooth troubles were so common, so persistent, that an entire economy had grown around them. Beyond those who performed extractions were those who sold remedies, those who made false teeth, those who offered various treatments that might delay or prevent the need for extraction. All of this existed because the human mouth was prone to failure, because teeth decayed and broke and became infected, and because the suffering this caused was significant enough that people would pay for relief. I began to wonder why this was so. Why were human teeth so vulnerable? Animals did not seem to suffer the same afflictions. Dogs and horses and cattle used their teeth throughout their lives without apparent trouble. Yet humans, for all our supposed superiority, seemed to have mouths that failed us regularly. Was this always true? Or had something changed? Had people in earlier centuries suffered less tooth trouble, or had they simply endured it differently? Left less record of their suffering? I had no way to answer these questions. I was a bookbinder, not a scholar or physician. My access to books beyond those I worked on was limited. But I became curious, began to pay attention when I encountered texts that touched on these matters. In the works that passed through our shop medical treatises, household guides, collections of recipes and remedies, I would sometimes find passages about teeth, about their care and treatment. The advice was often contradictory. Some authors recommended frequent cleaning with abrasive powders. Others warned against such practices, saying they wore away the enamel. Some suggested avoiding hot foods and cold drinks in sequence. Others said diet made little difference. What struck me was the uncertainty underlying all this advice. No one really understood teeth, understood what made them decay or how to prevent it. There were theories, certainly, many theories, but no consensus, no systematic knowledge. Treatment was based on trial and error, on tradition, on what had seemed to work for some people in some circumstances. And because teeth were hidden inside the mouth, difficult to examine closely, the mechanisms of their failure remained largely mysterious. This mystery extended to the treatment. Why did some extractions heal quickly while others led to prolonged infection? Why did some people survive procedures that killed others? The barber-surgeons could not explain these variations. They knew what to do in a general sense: remove the tooth, control what flowed from the wound, provide basic aftercare instructions, but they could not predict outcomes with any certainty. Each extraction was in some sense an experiment, an intervention into a system that was not fully understood. The 2 shillings I had paid for my extraction represented a significant portion of my income, but I came to realize I'd been fortunate in many ways. The procedure had been successful. The wound had healed without serious complication. I'd been able to return to work quickly. Many others were not so fortunate. I learned of a man who lived in our building, a weaver on the floor above, who had delayed treatment for an infected tooth until the infection had spread through his jaw and into his neck. By the time he finally sought help, no barber surgeon would attempt an extraction. The infection was too advanced, the swelling too severe. He was told to go home and prepare for a journey from which one did not return. He lingered for 2 weeks, growing steadily weaker, the fever consuming him. His wife could do nothing but keep him comfortable and pray. He died in considerable distress, and the death was attributed to the tooth, though in truth it was the infection that killed him, the corruption that his body could not fight. Such cases were not uncommon. Once an infection took hold deeply enough, spread beyond the localized area of a single tooth, the outcome was often fatal. There were no effective treatments for such widespread infection. One could lance and drain abscesses if they were accessible, could apply hot poultices, could pray and hope. But once the corruption entered the deeper tissues, once fever set in and strength began to fail, there was little to be done but wait and see whether the body would prevail. This reality created a cruel calculus. Wait too long to have a troublesome tooth removed, and you risked infection spreading to dangerous degree. But seek removal too early, when the tooth was merely painful, but not yet seriously corrupted, and you might undergo unnecessary suffering and expense. The decision of when to act was made more difficult by the fact that tooth pain did not always correlate with the severity of the underlying problem. A tooth might ache terribly, but be relatively simple to extract and quick to heal. Another might cause less pain, but harbour an infection that would prove deadly. People developed various strategies for managing this uncertainty. Some were quick to have teeth removed at the first sign of trouble, reasoning that early action was safer than delay. These people often lost teeth that might have been saved, might have quieted down and served for years longer. Others waited, sometimes too long, sometimes escaping serious consequence through luck alone. There was no right answer, no clear guidance. Each person had to make their own judgment, influenced by their tolerance for pain, their financial situation, their access to practitioners, their religious beliefs, and their previous experiences. The financial aspect could not be overlooked. 2 shillings was a manageable expense for me, but I was single, without dependents, earning steady wages. For someone with a family to support, with rent to pay and children to feed, 2 shillings represented a choice between treatment and other necessities. I knew men who worked with tooth pain for months, even years, because they could not afford to address it. Some eventually lost the tooth naturally, others lived with chronic discomfort, still others delayed until infection forced their hand, by which point treatment was more expensive and less likely to succeed. This economic reality meant that tooth troubles were more severe among the poor. Those with means could afford earlier intervention, could pay for better practitioners, could take time to recover without facing immediate financial crisis. Those without means suffered longer, risked more serious complications, and often faced worse outcomes. It was yet another way in which poverty compounded itself, in which lack of resources led to worse health, which in turn made it harder to work and earn. I saw this pattern in the faces of those around me. The labourers, the street sellers, the servants, the people who earned their bread through physical work. They often had poor teeth or no teeth, gaps in their smiles that spoke of suffering endured and incompletely addressed. The merchants, the lawyers, the gentlemen who came to our shop to commission fine bindings. They generally had better teeth, or at least fewer gaps, evidence of earlier treatment and greater access to care. The social implications were subtle, but real. A person's teeth became a marker of their station in life. Good teeth suggested someone who had resources, who took care of themselves, who had not been ground down by the hardships that affected those lower in the hierarchy. Poor teeth suggested the opposite, and because people judged one another partly by appearance, teeth mattered in ways that went beyond the merely practical. This troubled me, though I could not articulate exactly why. It seemed unjust that something as arbitrary as the health of one's teeth should affect how others perceived you, should influence your opportunities and prospects. But this was how society functioned. Appearance mattered. Visible deficiency, whether in teeth or clothes or bearing, marked you as someone of lesser status, someone less worthy of respect or consideration. Years passed. The tooth I had lost became simply a gap I learned to work around, a space my tongue found automatically when eating, a slight impediment to certain words. I had other teeth removed over time, 3 more by the time I reached 40, each extraction its own ordeal, though none quite as difficult as the first. Each loss changed how I ate, changed the balance and mechanics of chewing. I learned to prefer soft foods, learned which textures were manageable and which were not. I learned the particular loneliness of being unable to eat what others ate without difficulty, of having to choose carefully at meals, of being reminded constantly of one's physical limitations. The world around me was changing too, though slowly. New ideas about teeth and their care were beginning to circulate, particularly among the educated classes. There were men who specialized exclusively in teeth, who studied their structure and diseases, who wrote treatises on their treatment. These men were beginning to call themselves dentists rather than tooth drawers or operators, marking a shift towards something more professional, more systematic. They established practices in the better neighborhoods of London, fitted out offices with specialized equipment, charged fees that only the wealthy could afford. I never consulted one of these dentists. They were not for people like me. But I heard about them, heard that they used finer instruments, that they took more time with each patient, that they sometimes attempted to repair teeth rather than simply extracting them. They experimented with various materials for filling cavities, with techniques for stabilizing loose teeth, with mechanical devices to replace missing ones. Most of these experiments failed or produced mixed results, but the fact that such attempts were being made suggested a different approach was emerging, one based more on preserving teeth than simply removing them when they failed. This gradual change reflected broader shifts in how people thought about the body and its treatment. Medicine was becoming more systematic, more grounded in observation and experiment, rather than in ancient theory and tradition. The old ideas about humours and constitutions were being questioned, though not yet fully replaced. Anatomists were dissecting corpses and learning the actual structure of the human body, correcting errors that had persisted for centuries. Physicians were beginning to keep careful records of cases and outcomes, looking for patterns that might guide better treatment. Yet for ordinary people, these developments meant little in the short term. The care available to us remained much as it had always been. Barber-surgeons with their forceps and dental keys, extractions performed without anything to dull the pain, healing left to chance and constitution. The advances happened first at the top of society, and would take decades or centuries to work their way down to the rest of us. In the meantime, we endured as people had always endured. I thought often about the weaver who had died from his infected tooth, about how different his outcome might have been had he lived a century later, when perhaps there would be treatments we could not yet imagine. But he did not have that luxury. He lived when he lived, suffered when he suffered, and died because the knowledge and means to save him did not exist. His death was not the result of negligence or error, but of the simple fact that we did not yet know how to address certain problems, that our ability to cause suffering through treatment had outpaced our ability to heal effectively. This gap between what we could do and what we should do haunted me. We could extract teeth, could tear them from jaws, could cause immense pain in the service of removing sources of chronic pain, but we could not do so gently. could not make the process anything but an ordeal. We could not prevent teeth from failing in the first place, could not repair them once they began to decay. We were, in essence, managing failure rather than preventing or correcting it, and the management itself was crude, violent, risky. Would people 100 years hence look back on our practices with horror? Would they wonder how we tolerated such brutality, such uncertainty, such acceptance of suffering as simply the price of living? I suspected they would, just as we looked back on earlier eras and marvelled at practices that seemed barbaric to us. Each generation believes itself more advanced than the last, more humane, more enlightened. Perhaps this is necessary, this belief in progress, even when progress is slow and uneven and benefits some far more than others. I'm an old man now, past 60, writing these recollections in a room I rent near Gray's Inn, not far from where I worked as a younger man. The bookbinding trade has moved on without me. My hands are no longer steady enough for the fine work the craft demands, and younger men have taken the positions I once held. I live on small savings and on the charity of the parish, which provides a weekly allowance to those who have no other means. My teeth, or what remains of them, are few. I have perhaps 6 that still serve, scattered through my mouth in no particular pattern. I eat soup mostly, bread soaked until soft, vegetables boiled to the consistency of paste. I have not bitten into an apple in 20 years. I have not eaten meat that required cutting or tearing in longer than that. My diet has narrowed steadily as my ability to chew has diminished, and with it, I suspect, my overall vitality. This gradual loss has given me much time to reflect on teeth and their significance. They are such small things, easily overlooked when they function properly. Yet their failure has such profound effects. One's ability to eat influences one's health, one's strength, one's capacity to work and participate in life. Chronic pain influences one's temperament, one's patience, one's ability to maintain relationships and fulfill obligations. Visible tooth loss influences how others see you, whether they perceive you as someone deserving respect or someone to be pitied or dismissed. In a broader sense, teeth serve as a reminder of human fragility, of the many ways our bodies can fail us. We are not the durable creatures we might wish to be. We are vulnerable to corruption and decay, to infections that can overwhelm us, to pain that can dominate our consciousness. We are dependent on knowledge and skills we do not possess ourselves, on practitioners whose expertise varies widely, and whose treatments often involve suffering nearly as great as the original affliction. This vulnerability is something we share across all stations of life. The wealthy may have better access to treatment, may suffer less frequently and less severely, but they too lose teeth, to endure pain, to face the indignity of physical failure. In this at least there is a kind of equality, a reminder that for all our social distinctions we are made of the same fallible flesh. I think of the tooth I lost at 31, the extraction that was the worst experience of my life up to that point. I remember the pain of it, remember Roland's hands holding me in place, remember the sensation of the tooth tearing free and the flood of relief mixed with continued agony. I remember the taste of what stained the cloth, the weeks of careful eating, the gradual healing that left an absence I carry still. That experience taught me what I could endure. It taught me that the body can survive injuries that seem unbearable in the moment, that healing happens even when we cannot imagine it will. It taught me the limitations of the care available to us, the crude state of treatment, the vast gap between our ability to identify problems and our ability to solve them effectively. And it taught me compassion for others in pain, recognition of suffering I might previously have dismissed or failed to notice. These lessons have value, though I would not have chosen this way of learning them. Pain is a teacher, certainly, but a harsh one, and its lessons come at a cost. I am marked by what I have endured, shaped by it in ways both visible and invisible. The gaps in my mouth are the most obvious signs, but there are others. A wariness about seeking treatment, a tendency to endure discomfort longer than wise, a deep skepticism about promises of painless procedures or miraculous cures. As I near the end of my recollections, I find myself wondering what message I wish to convey. This is not meant to be merely a catalogue of suffering, though suffering features prominently. Nor is it meant to be a bitter condemnation of the primitive state of dental care in my time, though the care was indeed primitive. Rather, it is an attempt to record what it was like to live with tooth troubles in an era before modern remedies, to give voice to an experience that was nearly universal, but rarely documented in detail. Most histories speak of kings and wars, of great events and notable figures. Few record the smaller struggles, the daily trials of ordinary people managing bodies that failed them in ordinary ways. Yet these smaller struggles were the substance of most lives, the challenges that filled our days and shaped our characters. To ignore them is to miss something essential about what it meant to be human in that era. Could you endure what we endured? Could you face the prospect of having a tooth torn from your jaw with nothing to dull the pain, knowing the procedure might bring relief or might introduce new complications you could not predict? Could you live with chronic discomfort for weeks or months, unable to eat properly, unable to sleep soundly, all while maintaining the appearance of normalcy and continuing to work? Could you make the choice between spending money on treatment and spending it on food or shelter or other necessities? These were not hypothetical questions for us. They were real choices we faced, often multiple times over the course of our lives. The fact that most people managed these challenges without record, without complaint, without expecting sympathy or even acknowledgement, speaks to a resilience we possessed by necessity rather than choice. I do not romanticize that resilience. It was born of hardship, not virtue. We were not stronger or braver than people in more comfortable eras would be. We simply had no alternative. When treatment is crude and painful, when resources are limited, when social expectations demand that you bear difficulties without complaint, you learn to endure. You develop the capacity to continue functioning even when every instinct urges you to stop, to rest, to tend to your own needs before anything else. This capacity has its costs, living constantly with low-level discomfort, with pain managed but never fully resolved, with the knowledge that things will likely get worse before they get better. All of this takes a toll on the spirit. It makes a person harder, perhaps, less sympathetic to others' complaints, more likely to dismiss concerns that seem minor compared to what one has personally experienced. It can make a person bitter, can foster resentment toward those who seem to suffer less, who seem to glide through life without the constant friction of physical limitation. I have tried not to let these attitudes take root in me, though I confess I have not always succeeded. There have been times when I heard someone complain of some minor ailment and thought, with more contempt than charity, that they knew nothing of real suffering. There have been times when I saw the wealthy paying for treatments I could never afford and felt anger that was not entirely fair, as they did not choose their advantages any more than I chose my limitations. But I have also learned, slowly and incompletely, that suffering is not a competition, that the fact that I've endured certain hardships does not diminish others' right to acknowledgement of their own difficulties. Pain is real to the person experiencing it, regardless of how it compares to what others have faced. To dismiss someone's distress because you have known worse is to repeat the same callousness you perhaps received when you sought sympathy for your own troubles. This recognition has come late in my life, but it has come. I wish I had learned it earlier, had been more generous in my understanding of others, while I was still young enough to act on that understanding. But perhaps such wisdom can only be acquired through time and reflection, through the distance that age provides from the immediacy of one's own suffering. I do not know who will read these words or when or under what circumstances. Perhaps no one will. Perhaps this document will be lost or destroyed, will join the countless other records of ordinary lives that history does not preserve. But I write it nonetheless, because the act of writing gives form to experience, makes it something more than just memory, and because I hope that someone, sometime, might find value in knowing how we lived, what we faced, what we endured. If you are reading this in a time when teeth can be repaired rather than simply removed, when pain can be prevented or at least dulled significantly, when infection can be treated effectively with medicines we cannot now imagine, then know that you are fortunate. Know that the care you receive is the result of centuries of accumulated knowledge, of countless people suffering through crude treatments, so that gradually, incrementally better approaches could be developed. You are the beneficiary of progress you did not earn, but which you should not take for granted. If you are reading this in a time still struggling with these problems, still lacking effective treatments, still asking people to endure the tearing of teeth from jaws without adequate pain relief, then know that you are not alone in your suffering. Know that countless others have faced what you face, have survived it or succumbed to it, have carried the marks of it through their lives. Your pain is real, your fear is justified, and your struggle deserves acknowledgement, even if it does not receive it. And if you are reading this having never known serious tooth trouble, having been spared the ordeal I have described, then know that you have been spared something significant. Do not dismiss those who have not been so fortunate. Do not assume that their troubles are minor or that their complaints are exaggerated. The gap between functioning teeth and failing ones is wider than you might imagine, and crossing from one state to the other teaches lessons that cannot be learned any other way. I have lived an ordinary life, by most measures. I learned a trade, practiced it to the best of my ability, earned modest wages, lived in modest circumstances, formed few close relationships, left no children to carry on my name. When I die, likely soon, I will disappear from the world's notice as completely as though I had never existed. The books I bound may survive me, but no one will know whose hands assembled them, whose needle drew the thread through their spines, whose fingers pressed the leather to their covers. Yet I have known things worth knowing. I have learned what the body can endure, and what the spirit must accept. I have witnessed the kindness of strangers, the landlady who shared her gin, Roland who performed his work with as much care as his knowledge allowed, Frost who offered advice born of his own suffering. I have seen how people manage impossible choices, how they balance competing needs with inadequate resources, how they continue moving forward even when every step brings discomfort. These observations may seem small compared to the grand sweep of history, but they are no less true for being small. The great events, the wars and political upheavals and social transformations matter, certainly, but they happen to people whose daily lives consist largely of managing ordinary difficulties. Understanding those difficulties, acknowledging them, recording them, this too has value. My tooth, that troublesome molar removed on a rainy Monday afternoon in 1782, was both a small thing and a large one. Small in the sense that it was merely one tooth among 32, merely one episode of pain among the countless instances of suffering that occur constantly throughout the world. Large in the sense that for me, during the weeks it troubled me, and the day it was removed, it was everything. It commanded my full attention, shaped my decisions, taught me lessons I could not have learned otherwise. This is the paradox of physical suffering. It is simultaneously universal and intensely personal. Everyone experiences it, yet each person's experience is unique. Everyone who has lost a tooth knows something of what I describe, yet no one knows it exactly as I knew it, because no one else was in my body, in my circumstances, facing my particular combination of challenges and choices. By writing this account, I hope to bridge that gap slightly, to allow others to glimpse what it was like to be me, to be anyone living in this era with this problem. Not for purposes of sympathy necessarily, though I would not refuse sympathy if offered. More to create a record, a testimony, evidence that we existed and struggled and found ways to continue, despite obstacles that might seem, to those in more comfortable circumstances, insurmountable. In the years following my first extraction, I came to understand that tooth troubles were part of a larger pattern of bodily vulnerability that defined existence for most people in my time. We lived with discomforts and limitations that were simply accepted as the natural condition of being human. Bad backs from years of physical labour, failing eyesight with no adequate correction available, hearing that dimmed with age, joints that ached in cold weather. Digestion troubled by poor diet or spoiled food, these were so common as to barely merit comment. Teeth were perhaps unique in that their failure was visible, that it marked a person in ways that other afflictions did not. You could hide a bad back by moving carefully, could compensate for poor hearing by positioning yourself strategically in conversations, could manage digestive troubles privately. But teeth, or their absence, showed in your face, affected your speech, limited what you could eat in the presence of others. They were a public affliction in a way that many other conditions were not. This visibility created its own social dynamics. People with good teeth were presumed to be healthier, more vigorous, more capable than those with poor teeth. Whether this presumption had any basis in fact was debatable, but it influenced how people were perceived and treated. A young person seeking employment, for instance, might be judged partly on their teeth, on the assumption that someone with failing teeth would soon be less able to work, less reliable, more prone to absence due to pain or infection. These judgments were rarely stated explicitly but operated nonetheless. I saw it in the way people responded to those whose teeth were obviously poor, a subtle distancing, a slight reduction in respect. I saw it too in how people who began losing teeth would sometimes withdraw socially, would smile less, would become quieter in groups, as though their physical diminishment required corresponding social diminishment. The broader economic implications were significant as well. Days lost to tooth pain, reduced capacity to eat and maintain strength, the cost of treatments. All of this represented a substantial burden on working people. A family where the primary earner lost significant work time due to tooth troubles might fall behind on rent, might be unable to purchase adequate food, might begin a slide into deeper poverty that was difficult to reverse. The bodily failure and economic failure reinforced each other, creating downward spirals that claimed many who had started from modest but stable circumstances. I was fortunate in this regard. My tooth troubles, while significant, never incapacitated me for long enough to threaten my livelihood permanently. I had lost time from work, certainly, and had spent money I could ill afford on treatment and remedies, but I had not been pushed into genuine destitution, had not lost my position, had not been forced to rely entirely on charity or the workhouse. Many others were not so fortunate. The workhouse, that grim institution where those without means ended their days, was filled with people whose lives had been undone by cascading misfortunes, of which physical ailments were often the beginning. Unable to work due to pain or weakness, unable to afford treatment, they would exhaust whatever resources they had, would be evicted from lodgings, would find themselves on parish relief. The workhouse was the final destination for those who had no family to support them and no means of supporting themselves, a place where the food was meagre, the conditions harsh, and the prospects for improvement nil. I visited the workhouse once, accompanying a clergyman who made regular visits to minister to those confined there. The experience left a deep impression. The building itself was large and cold, its rooms crowded with people who had reached the end of their resources. Many were elderly, their bodies worn out by decades of labour and hardship. Many were ill with conditions that would not improve, that would eventually carry them to the journey from which one did not return. Some were younger, victims of accidents or acute illnesses that had left them unable to work. What struck me most was the hopelessness of the place, the sense that those inside had been set aside by society, warehoused until they died. There were rules and regulations, mandatory work for those capable of it, religious instruction, basic provisions of food and shelter. But there was little warmth, little kindness, little recognition of the humanity of those confined there. They were problems to be managed, burdens to be borne by the parish, evidence of failure their own or society's. Depending on one's perspective, among the residents I saw several with obviously poor teeth or no teeth at all. One woman, perhaps 50 but looking far older, had only a few stumps remaining in her mouth. She could eat almost nothing, survived on broth and bread, soaked until it disintegrated. She had been a seamstress, she told me, had lost her teeth gradually over the years, had continued working as long as she could, but as her ability to eat diminished, so did her strength, and eventually she could no longer maintain the pace and precision the work demanded. She had lost her position, had been unable to find other employment, and had ended here. Her story was not unique. I heard variations of it from several others. Physical diminishment leading to reduced capacity for work, leading to loss of income, leading to inability to maintain oneself, leading eventually to dependence on institutional charity. It was a progression that could begin with something as seemingly minor as a troublesome tooth, and once started, was difficult to arrest. This pattern troubled me deeply. It suggested that the line between maintaining oneself and falling into destitution was thinner than people like to believe, that much of what separated the independent labourer from the workhouse inmate was simply luck, the luck of having a constitution that held up under stress, the luck of avoiding serious illness or injury, the luck of not losing too many teeth too quickly. As the 18th century gave way to the 19th, and as I moved from middle age toward elderly status, I began to notice changes in how tooth troubles were understood and addressed. The changes were gradual and uneven, affecting the wealthy long before they touched people of my station, but they were real. The dentists I had heard about, those practitioners who specialized exclusively in teeth, grew more numerous and more skilled. They were developing new instruments, finer and more precise than the crude forceps and dental keys of earlier years. They were experimenting with ways to save teeth rather than simply extracting them, drilling out decayed portions and filling the cavities with various substances, lead, tin, even gold for those who could afford it. These techniques were imperfect, often failed, but the fact that they were being attempted represented a shift in thinking. There was also growing understanding of what caused teeth to decay. The old theories about worms and humours were gradually being abandoned in favour of explanations that focused on acids, on bacteria, too small to see without magnification, on the chemistry of what happened when certain foods contacted tooth surfaces. This knowledge had not yet translated into effective preventive measures that ordinary people could employ, but it suggested that such measures might eventually be possible. Pain management was improving as well, though again slowly and unevenly. Ether and chloroform were being used experimentally to render patients unconscious during surgical procedures. I heard stories of teeth being extracted while the patient felt nothing, waking afterward with no memory of the procedure itself. This seemed almost miraculous to me, having experienced extraction in full consciousness. The idea that such suffering could be prevented, could be bypassed entirely through chemical means, was difficult to credit, but apparently true. These advances remained largely unavailable to working people. The dentists who employed them charged fees that put their services beyond our reach. The hospitals and clinics where experimental techniques were practiced served primarily as training grounds for medical students, with the poor as subjects for learning. One could receive free or low-cost treatment in such settings, but at the cost of being worked on by inexperienced practitioners under the observation of their instructors, with all the risks that implied. Still, the existence of these advances suggested a future in which tooth troubles might be less dire, less inevitable, less frequently leading to the consequences I had witnessed. This was a comforting thought, even if I personally would not live to see that future fully realized. The young people being born now, or their children, or their children's children, they might grow up in a world where losing teeth was uncommon, where decay could be arrested and reversed, where pain could be prevented rather than merely endured. Whether such progress would extend to all classes or remain a privilege of the wealthy was an open question. The pattern I had observed throughout my life suggested that improvements in care reached the top of society first, then filtered slowly downward over generations. Those at the bottom might wait decades or centuries for benefits that those at the top enjoyed immediately. This was unjust, certainly, but it was how society functioned. Resources flowed toward those who already had resources, while those without were expected to make do with whatever eventually trickled down. I had no illusions that this would change fundamentally. Human nature being what it was, those with advantages would work to preserve them, would ensure their children received better care, better education, better opportunities than the children of the poor. The gaps between classes might narrow slightly with overall prosperity, but they would not disappear. There would always be those who suffered more and those who suffered less. Those who had access to the best that medicine and science could offer, and those who made do with whatever they could afford or endure. This recognition did not make me bitter, exactly, though it certainly made me skeptical of claims that society was organized fairly, that those who worked hard would be rewarded appropriately, that virtue and effort were reliably connected to positive outcomes. I had worked hard my entire life. I had been as virtuous as my circumstances allowed, had not stolen, had not deliberately harmed others, had tried to be honest in my dealings, yet I had still lost my teeth, still suffered through crude treatments, still faced old age with inadequate resources and a body that had failed me in multiple ways. The wealthy who had never known such difficulties might attribute their good fortune to superior character or divine favour. From where I stood, it looked more like luck, like the accident of being born into circumstances that provided advantages that compounded over time. This was not to say that individual choices made no difference, but rather that those choices operated within constraints that varied dramatically depending on one's starting position. In my final years, as I approach the end of whatever time remains to me, I find myself returning repeatedly to the question of what my experiences have meant, what lessons they contain that might be worth passing on. This is perhaps the natural inclination of the elderly to seek meaning in what they have lived through, to find some pattern or purpose in experiences that may have been largely random. The most obvious lesson is simply this: the body is fragile, prone to failure, and will eventually betray all of us regardless of our efforts to maintain it. This is not a cheerful lesson, but it is true. We are born with certain endowments: the teeth we inherit, the constitution we possess, the basic soundness or unsoundness of our physical forms, and these endowments influence our lives in profound ways. We can work to preserve what we have, can try to minimize damage, can seek treatment when problems arise, but ultimately we are engaged in a losing battle. Time and circumstance will wear us down. What we build, including our own bodies, will eventually fall apart. This recognition might lead to despair if dwelt upon excessively. Why work to maintain something that is doomed to fail? Why endure present discomfort to prevent future decay when future decay is inevitable regardless? These are questions that can paralyze action if taken to their logical extreme. The answer, I have come to believe, is that we maintain ourselves not because we can achieve permanent success, but because the alternative giving up, surrendering to decay, is worse. A tooth that has begun to decay will not heal itself, but it might be preserved for additional years with proper care. Those additional years matter, even if they do not represent final victory. Life is not about achieving permanence, but about managing impermanence as well as possible. Another lesson concerns the relationship between physical suffering and character. There is a common belief that suffering ennobles, that enduring hardship makes a person stronger, better, more virtuous. My experience suggests this is only partially true. Suffering can teach lessons: patience, endurance, sympathy for others in similar circumstances. But it can also make a person bitter, resentful, harder in ways that are not entirely positive. Much depends on how one responds to suffering, whether one allows it to open one's understanding or to close one's heart. I have known people who endured terrible difficulties and emerged with grace, with kindness intact, with generosity toward others, despite having little themselves. I have also known people who endured similar difficulties and became mean, small-spirited, quick to judge others harshly. The suffering itself did not determine the outcome. Something else, some quality of character, some choice about how to interpret and respond to hardship made the difference. I cannot claim to have emerged from my own difficulties with perfect grace. I have been bitter at times, resentful at times, harder than I wish I had been. But I have also tried, however imperfectly, to retain some measure of compassion, to remember that others are fighting battles I cannot see, to extend the understanding I would wish to receive. A third lesson concerns the importance of small kindnesses: the landlady who shared her gin, Roland who performed the extraction as carefully as he knew how, the fellow journeyman who offered advice. These people were not heroes, were not performing dramatic acts of charity. They were simply being decent to someone in difficulty, offering what help they could within the constraints of their own circumstances. Yet these small acts mattered enormously. They provided comfort when comfort was scarce, hope when hope seemed unwarranted, evidence that not everyone was indifferent to another's suffering. Looking back across my life, these small kindnesses stand out far more clearly than many events that seem more significant at the time. A kind word, a shared remedy, a gesture of understanding. These are what I remember, what sustained me through difficult periods. This suggests that we all have more power than we might realize to affect others' lives. We may not be able to solve large problems, may not be able to change fundamental conditions of existence, but we can choose to be kind rather than indifferent, to offer help rather than turn away, to acknowledge suffering rather than pretend it does not exist. These choices matter, even when their effects are not dramatic or immediately visible. I have written more than I intended when I began this account. The memories have flowed more freely than I expected, each one leading to another, the entire structure of my life becoming visible through the lens of this single recurring difficulty. Perhaps this is fitting. Teeth, though small parts of our anatomy, touch so many aspects of existence: eating, speaking, appearance, social interaction, work capacity, overall health. To trace the history of one's teeth is in some sense to trace the history of one's life. The tooth I lost in 1782 was merely the first of several. Each subsequent loss was its own event, its own negotiation with pain and fear, and the necessity of treatment. By my 50th year, I had lost nearly half my teeth. By 60, I had lost all but the few remaining now. Each loss diminished me slightly, reduced my capacity to eat and speak, changed how I appeared to others and to myself. The cumulative effect has been significant, though I have adapted, have learned to manage with what remains. Would I have lived differently, knowing what I know now? Would I have sought treatment earlier for that first troublesome tooth, before the infection had established itself so deeply? Perhaps, though I did seek treatment as soon as I could afford it, and convinced myself it was necessary. Would I have taken better care of my teeth generally? Would I have been more diligent about cleaning them, about avoiding foods that contributed to decay? Possibly, though our knowledge of what helped and what harmed was limited, and much advice was contradictory. The truth is that I probably would have lived much the same, because I had limited information and limited resources, and faced the same pressures that shaped my original choices. This is perhaps the hardest lesson of all, that we are more constrained than we like to believe, that many outcomes are determined by factors beyond our control, that even perfect knowledge would not necessarily have enabled me to achieve dramatically different results. This is not to absolve myself of all responsibility for what befell me. I made choices, some better than others. I delayed treatment when earlier action might have been wiser. I endured pain longer than necessary, because I was afraid or because I wanted to save money. I failed to follow certain advice because I did not believe it, or because I found it inconvenient. These were genuine choices, and they had consequences. But they were choices made within severe constraints. I could not afford expensive dentists, I could not take unlimited time away from work, I could not access knowledge that did not yet exist, or treatments that had not yet been developed. I did the best I could with what I had, and the results were mixed, as results tend to be in real life. If there is a final message I wish to convey, it is perhaps this: judge people gently, yourself included. We are all managing difficulties we did not choose, working with imperfect information, trying to balance competing needs with inadequate resources. Some navigate these challenges more successfully than others, but success is partly luck, partly circumstance, partly the accident of being born with certain advantages rather than certain disadvantages. Those who have never known serious tooth trouble never face the choice between enduring pain and submitting to crude treatment, never experience the social diminishment that comes with visible physical deterioration. These fortunate people should not assume that those who have suffered these things are weaker or less capable. They are simply less lucky. Had circumstances been different, had the accidents of birth and life distributed advantages differently, those who now judge might be those judged, and those now judged might be those secure enough to offer judgment. This recognition of our common vulnerability, our shared fragility, should perhaps inspire more compassion than it often does. We are all, without exception, living in bodies that will eventually fail, that are failing even now in small ways we may not yet notice. The person whose teeth are strong today may find them failing tomorrow. The person who judges another's diminishment harshly may find themselves seeking sympathy for their own diminishment before long. Life teaches these lessons if we are willing to learn them. Pain, loss, limitation, decline. These are not aberrations, but the normal course of existence. What varies is timing and degree, not the fundamental pattern. We are born, we grow, we reach some peak of capacity, then we gradually or suddenly decline, until we reach the point where the journey from which one does not return must be undertaken. My teeth, failing over decades, mark the stages of this journey in a particularly visible way. But they were only one marker among many. My strength has ebbed, my vision has dimmed, my hearing has become less acute, my memory has grown unreliable. I am, in short, an old man, and old age is itself a form of failure, a gradual withdrawal of the body's cooperation with the will's intentions. I do not write this seeking pity. I write it as testimony, as witness, as evidence that one person passed through this world and struggled with difficulties that were typical of his time and station. I write it hoping that someone, somehow, might find in these words some recognition of their own experience, some comfort in knowing that what they face has been faced before, some encouragement to continue despite the weight of accumulated hardship. And I write it as a kind of memorial to that first tooth, that molar removed in 1782, the loss that taught me so much about pain and fear and courage, and the strange mercy of having something terrible end, even if the ending itself is terrible. That tooth is long gone, discarded in Roland's waste bowl, mixed with other extracted teeth, eventually disposed of in some manner I never learned. Yet it remains with me in memory, in the gap it left, in the lessons its loss taught. We are made, in part, of our losses. What we have endured shapes us as much as what we have accomplished. The gaps and scars and diminishments we carry tell the story of our journey through time and circumstance. To pretend these things do not matter, to focus only on achievements and successes, is to miss much of what makes us human. So I acknowledge my losses. I acknowledge the tooth pulled in 1782 and the others that followed. I acknowledge the pain and fear and the crude treatments. I acknowledge the social diminishment and the dietary restrictions and the visible evidence of a body that has served me imperfectly, but served nonetheless. These things are part of who I am, part of what I have learned, part of what I have to offer in these final words. To those who read this, may you be spared what I have endured. May you live in times when such suffering is preventable, or at least manageable. May you have access to knowledge and care that were unavailable to me. But if you are not spared, if you face similar challenges, know that they can be survived, that people have survived them before you and will survive them after you, and that survival itself is a kind of victory even when it is not accompanied by comfort or ease. May your teeth serve you well. May your body not fail you too quickly or too cruelly. May you have access to care when you need it. And may that care be gentle and effective. And may you remember, when you encounter someone whose body has failed them visibly, that you are looking at someone who has survived challenges you may not understand, who carries knowledge earned through suffering, who deserves recognition not as a cautionary tale or an object of pity, but as a fellow human being managing existence as best they can. This is the testimony of one who lived through tooth troubles in an age before modern care. It is offered not as complaint, but as witness. It is offered in hope that understanding how things were might help us appreciate how things are, and might inspire us to work toward a future where suffering is prevented rather than merely endured. I'm finished now. The account is complete. What I have written will stand or fall on its own merits. I have no more to add, no wisdom left to share, no observations that have not already been made. I have told my story as honestly and completely as I am able. It remains only to sign my name and date this document, to seal it, and to leave it wherever it may be found by whoever might care to read it. May they read with understanding. May they find in these words something of value. And may they be grateful for whatever advances time has brought to the care of human bodies and the relief of human suffering. Written in London in the year 1815 by one who has lived long enough to see much change and to understand that change comes slowly, benefits some more than others, and always leaves room for further improvement. The tooth that would not be silent has been silent now for many years, but its memory speaks still, a reminder of what was endured, what was learned, and what might yet be improved for those who follow.